My name is Liam Riley. I'm an organizer with the Cooper Square Committee, and tonight we'll be joined by Lead Dust Free NYC member leaders Jim Markowitz, Sandy Meyer, and Ed Rudick, as well as my colleagues at CSC, Brandon Kilbasa, our Director of Organizing and Policy, and Jody Leidecker, another wonderful and talented organizer at Cooper Square. We're also joined by Dr. Morri Markowitz, Director of the Lead Poisoning and Treatment Program at Montefiore Medical Center. With that, we can't wait to start tonight's workshop. We'll start with a general overview of the prominence and history of lead and its effects on our lives before offering a number of tips and resources to help you identify lead hazards in your home and fight back against lead exposure, both systemically and personally. Next slide, please. So why should we care about lead? To some, it may seem like a tired issue, as the U.S. banned the use of lead paint decades ago. However, lead-based paints do exist in much of our existing housing stock, and globally, about 1/3 of children have been found to have elevated blood lead levels above 5 micrograms per deciliter. Next slide, please. So more reasons we should care about lead. Lead is poisonous, and lead can be found anywhere. And while it's now banned, as I mentioned earlier, lead paint can be found in much of our older housing stock, especially in New York City, where the majority of the housing was built prior to 1960. Lead exposure can permanently impair children, both mentally and physically. And in adults, lead exposure can cause health complications and significant organ damage. Acute cases of lead poisoning can result in coma, seizures, and death. Next slide, please. So this graphic points out that pre-industrial blood lead levels in humans were minimal. However, by 1980, we see here that Americans carried a vastly higher level of lead in their blood, significantly closer to the profile to its right, which shows a human with overt clinical lead poisoning.
This workshop will cover New York City's toxic lead history, assessing the lead threat in your building, how to monitor your landlord's renovation in your building, ways to protect your health, and connecting to the larger movement to prevent lead poisoning. Next.
So I'm Jim Markowitz. I'm going to talk a little bit about the toxic history of lead in New York State and New York City, just to give some background to this. So let's talk a little bit about the mining and the marketing of lead. Lead has been mined in New York State since the 1800s, mostly in the Hudson Valley and in the Adirondack Mountains. And why is any ore mined? It's because it has a lot of industrial and commercial uses. So lead has been used in paint, which we're going to talk about tonight primarily, but a whole slew of other uses as well. It was used as an additive to gasoline for almost 70 years. In lead acid batteries in your car, solder. When water pipes were metal, they were connected using lead solder. The ceramic glazes on potteries, in ammunition, toys, even in cheap jewelry, sometimes in imported spices, and even in makeup products like eyeliner and lipstick. So remember when Liam just said that lead can be anywhere, this is a good indication of how. So the dangers of lead were known a century ago. Most of Europe banned the use of lead in paint in the 1920s. But in the United States, where the same threat was known, it was decided that the dangers of lead would be countered by massive marketing and advertising programs. Dutch Boy Paint was one of the most prolific advertisers. And not only would they not hesitate to market their product despite its toxicity, they would do so directly to children. encouraging kids to paint their own toys and suggested they use lead paint to do it. So the prevalence of lead in New York City homes peaked around 1922. Even though New York City banned the sale of lead paint for residences in 1960, a lot of the residue from that remains. There was a lot of excess stock of lead paint that was put to use for interior painting. Sometimes it was exterior paint used on the interiors of buildings, but basically it's all over buildings that were built before 1960. By the late 1970s, 88% of kids tested still had levels, blood lead levels above 10 micrograms per deciliter in their blood. And among poor Black children, the percentage was extremely high. By 1978, the US finally capped the amount of lead in consumer products. That is, they couldn't keep putting it in products, but that didn't do anything to get rid of the products that were already out there. So there was activity to try and draw attention to the fact that children in New York City were being poisoned by lead paint on the walls of the houses they lived in. The Young Lords were an organization that started in Chicago, and with guidance from the Black Panthers, they actually managed to embarrass the city government into action in 1969 by voluntarily going around themselves door to door in Harlem and administering lead tests to children who lived there. So if anyone thinks that activism doesn't have results, this is an indication that it really did, and it still does. In the tests that they administered, they found that 30% of the children they tested had elevated lead levels. And again, if you think back to one of the slides that Liam showed before, that sort of corresponds to the 1 in 3 children worldwide. So the city did try to take action after this. It was publicized in the Village Voice. A reporter named Jack Newfield wrote numerous articles about it. And the city did finally begin to face the fact that they had an enormous problem on their hands. So the city then tried to legislate against the use of lead paint. And there were bills that were attempted to be passed in 1982 and 1999, but they really had little effect. Finally, in 2004, the New York City Council passed Local Law 1 of 2004. This law required landlords to remediate lead paint situations in buildings where children under the age of 6 lived, and also laid down very specific and stringent guidelines for what procedures they would have to follow when they were doing renovation and demolition work in residential buildings. So after the passage of Local Law 1 of 2004, lead poisoning rates actually declined. However, over time, that enforcement lapsed. In November of 2019, the New York Times found that there were still 11,000 kids, more than 11,000 kids, with blood levels that were elevated in New York City. So the issue is really one of enforcement. The law is there. We just have to make sure that it is enforced. So here's a little quiz. We're going to end each section of this workshop tonight with a little quiz. And the first one is going to ask, what type of products were not made with lead? So if you were paying attention before, you will know the answer to this. You can put it in the chat if you want, or you can shout it out loud, but you're muted so no one will hear you. Pottery, toys, eyeliner, bullets, or tooth fillings? And the answer is tooth fillings. They were made from an amalgam that included mercury, but not lead. So we're going to proceed now to the next section of the workshop with Brandon Kilbasa talking about how you can assess the lead danger level in your building.
Thank you, Jim. That was great. It's worth noting that Local Law 1 of 2004 was also an uphill battle that involved lots of activism to get it passed. That Mayor Bloomberg attempted to veto the law, actually, and the council overturned the veto. So the forces of capitalism and the politicians they can buy really is a something to keep in mind as we go through the presentation. Our safety really depends on us being active in our communities. So in the next set of slides, I'm going to talk about how we can assess the lead threat in your building. And really, this is going to start to turn into a portion of the presentation that gives you a lot of practical information. So the presentation will be available for you later as well, but keep an eye on the visuals and some of the kind of factoids that we're going to present here. We designed it so you could take it with you and keep it in mind as you, venture into the buildings you live and work in and where your kids go to school and things like that. So yeah, this next set of slides is assessing the lead threat in your building. How do you know if lead exists in your building? All right, next slide, please. So in a couple slides, we're going to talk more about this 1960 date and why it's significant with lead hazards. But generally speaking, the older buildings, any old building in New York City is one that you're going to want to be more careful in when you think about looming hazards. And we'll talk again about the significance of the pre-1960 in a minute. But when you're in an old building in New York City, the areas to look out for lead hazards are going to be basically in the deterioration of paint in any area. And you're going to want to keep an eye for dust from interior and exterior paint, what they call chalking, chipping, or peeling of lead paint. Whenever you see any kind of obvious indication that paint is chipping or cracking or anything like that, it's not going to just be the chips themselves that are dangerous, but when a surface gets deteriorated like that, it's going to actually shed lead dust as well, which can be really hazardous. And it doesn't take a lot of dust to poison a child or over time to make even an adult sick. So when you see the telltale signs of this chipping, peeling paint, especially keep an eye on that. That's going to be a hazard area or danger area. Painted friction surfaces. This is another area. So besides any kind of chipping or peeling paint you'd see in any area of an old building, keep an eye on the doors and windows. When these doors and windows slide or close, you're gonna have happen is that they're gonna start to shed a kind of microscopic lead dust by the actual paint being abrased, the abrasion that happens there, the friction that occurs constantly. So we're not using lead paint anymore, but the lead paint is underneath the other coats of paint that are on top. And as things get worn out and deteriorate, you're going to start to get into that lead paint and you're going to start to generate dust. So keep an eye on all friction surfaces. That's another area to just flag and a danger zone for this kind of thing. And keep in mind that dust tends to settle onto floors and near floors. It can be on the walls as chalking, and you're going to also see in any fabric like drapes, carpets, furniture, anything like that, if it picks up the dust will be settled into it. So you want to be careful with that as well. And Sandy and others later in the presentation can talk a little bit more about just generally how to, keep your apartment to minimize these risks. But those are the big areas to look out for. We're going to go to the next slide, please. So again, as this pre-1960 number we're going to describe that a little bit more here. How do you know if there's a lead dust hazard in your building, your New York City building? Lead-based paint hazards are presumed to exist in dwelling units and common areas in buildings that were built before January 1st, 1960. So this is a date to keep in mind. Over 80% of New York's housing stock was built before 1960. So we live in a city with a lot of old housing. Virtually all of us are probably living in housing that has some lead paint in it somewhere. So you want to be careful. You can, Cooper Square or any other tenants' rights organization can really help you actually look up the date that your building was built at through the Department of Buildings records if you want to do that. But I would generally, say like if you think the building is in this range, and again, 80% of the housing is, then just assume it's pre-1960. And with that, you can call stuff into the city with that assumption saying, I believe there's lead paint in my building. But the law says January 1st, 1960, so we just want you to be aware of that and have that in mind when thinking about lead hazards. So a huge thing to consider when you're assessing lead hazards in your building for your own families and for others living in the building is, do children reside in the building? Children are particularly vulnerable to lead poisoning. Adults are affected by it. It's not good for us, there's no question, but kids, especially kids under the age of 6, can have devastating health and developmental impacts from lead poisoning. And they're pretty much all completely avoidable if we were to get the city to do what they're supposed to do, and landlords to do what they're supposed to do, and then for us also to be vigilant. So yeah, if children reside in a building, you're going to want to really keep in mind everything we're talking about tonight, and keep that in mind in your assessment. If a child under the age of 6 spends 10 or more hours a week in a dwelling, then local law 1 is there to protect their health. So the law says that basically 10 or more hours in a unit makes it so that the child is said to reside in the unit, and at that point you're going to want to be more careful. You'll also be able to call the city and say that a child is in the unit often, or that it resides there. There's ins and outs with this number of 10 hours a week, but Cooper Square or any other housing group can help you sort through that. But this is the kind of thing you want to keep in mind for yourself and for your neighbors. If you have neighbors who have kids, if there's kids in anywhere in the building, just be more cautious of the lead hazards. So for conditions to look for, and this is what I meant by practical information. Those of you joining us online today, and again, if you're not online today and you're calling in, we're going to send you the presentation later so you can see these images. But these are images of things you really want to look out for. So cracks in the paint, like the photo on the left demonstrates. Peeling paint, obviously there. What's happening when paint peels like that is it's exposing the other layers of paint underneath, and that's where the lead layers likely exist. And then sloppy construction. So anytime you see the cracks, the peeling paint, you're going to see, they're the more obvious blemish in the area that can point you towards being a hazard, but you also want to be mindful that with these comes dust. So the dust itself is going to be shedding off of these areas, settling into the ground near them, chalking and maintaining itself on the wall nearby. And then the sloppy construction, the picture you see on the right is something that a lot of neighborhoods that are in the grips of gentrification are seeing more and more of this kind of thing. As landlords, have this mad dash to renovate rent-regulated apartments, they're doing them as fast and cheap as possible. So you're going to see them cutting corners and not following the safe work practices while they renovate. And you can see in this photo on the right that this plastic substrate that's on the door in front of the apartment unit door is called a zip door, and it has zippers around it. Sometimes the zipper will run up the center of it instead of around the sides. The zip door is the substrate that's supposed to keep the dust and the air with the dust in it back in the unit while the workers do the demolition or any work that they're doing inside there, so it doesn't come out into the hallway areas. They're also supposed to keep something like a mat or a floor covering right outside the door where that would catch the dust on the workers' boots as they come and go. And what you see in the photo there is not what we want to see. The actual substrate has holes ripped in it. It's not tight. It doesn't fit. It doesn't fit the door properly. It doesn't meet the ground at a tight, flush kind of fit. And what they're using to wipe their boots is an old dirty cloth, which could be used if it was changed and put in place properly, but in fact it's kicked off to the side and not really doing anything. So anytime you see this kind of stuff, we're going to get into the remedies for these things later in the presentation, but your first line of action should be to call your landlord to try to get them to handle it. And it's very likely they won't do that. Then don't wait forever. Go ahead and call 311 and start to report these things, and especially flag if there's children in the building, because the city takes cases of lead contamination and lead hazards far more serious when it's noted that a child either lives in the unit or is in the building. Here's some more great photos. Again, really good practical information you can take with you. Look around your building, look around the buildings that you work in, that your children might go to school in, any place you're spending a lot of time. So, check the friction surfaces. As the slide says, really important to do that. You got a picture of a door, some steps, a window frame, and a radiator there. Again, door frames, window sills, outdoor steps, radiators. Radiators kind of expand and contract as they heat. They can be surfaces that paint has a difficult time adhering to sometimes. But anytime you see the chipped and peeling paint, keep an eye for that. Also understand that the chipped and peeling paint is generating dust as well. You want to be careful about that. Next slide. Yep. Of special concern, lead, dust, and renovations. As I was mentioning on the earlier slide, the demolition that we see in many of these older buildings generates huge amounts of hazardous lead dust when not properly controlled. Local Law 1 actually has as one of its tenets, it says that landlord is responsible for controlling the dispersion of dust. It's one of I mean, I think that's an actual quote from the law. So while the landlord does these demolition projects, they're causing dust. Sometimes that's going to be seeping out into the common areas. Sometimes it's going to be seeping out into the neighboring units. Even if they're doing some of the things that the law calls for, like keeping zip doors up and all that, and hauling debris properly, if the dust is starting to infiltrate your apartment, they have a responsibility to figure out how to make it so it doesn't. That portion of law and that forces them to figure out how to control the dust is really important here. So demolition of apartments and the dust particles, workers not covering the doors is a big deal. Unclosed containers where they're hauling debris, or bags that are open or torn when they're hauling debris are huge issues. In the walk-up buildings we have in the Lower East Side, we see a lot of landlords haul the debris in open cans, and as they do, they bounce these cans down each step, sometimes from the 5th floor all the way down, creating just giant toxic clouds of lead, lead-heavy dust, and it's absolutely not the right way to do it. The bags themselves need to be tied tight and then disposed of in the dumpster properly. Landlords are really supposed to have their work crews, covering the dumpster when they're not using it, and then uncovering it to dump the debris and then recovering it. What we frequently see is it's not covered at all, or it's uncovered in the morning and then all the work starts and they just dump stuff in all day long, and then they might cover it at the end of the day. That's not the way to do it. You should call 311 if you see something like that, and DEP will come out for it. And here on our final slide of the assessing lead hazards section of the presentation, we're going to do a little quiz. So what's the primary way kids are being exposed to lead today? And I'll give you a little hint. This is a bit of a trick question. So 1, eating sweet tasting paint chips. 2, playing outdoors in toxic soil. 3, drinking water from old pipes. 4, lead dust from old paint. Or 5, school cafeterias and classrooms. Okay, and you can put your answers in the chat if you like. And we're going to go to the next slide with the answer. So yeah, the trick part of the question that I was mentioning, giving you the clue on, was just that while all of these can be sources of lead contamination, and they are, very often all of these lead towards some contamination, the primary pathway for children being exposed to lead is dust from old paint. And this can happen in your home, as we're talking a lot about tonight, but it can also happen in your school or any other old building that the kids are in regularly. And, adults, again, same applies to you. We highlight children very often because it is, again, they are the most vulnerable when it comes to this. They are the most affected. So I'm going to end this section of the presentation and go ahead and turn it over to wonderful organizer Liam Riley, who has been working very hard on this presentation, and one of our great tenant leaders who's done a lot of work on the lead safety work throughout the years, Ed Rudick. All right, thank you.
Hey folks, so this section will offer some insight on monitoring construction and renovations in your building to ensure that you and your neighbors can spot illegal or dangerous construction work and defend yourself, your children, and your neighbors from lead exposure. Next slide, please. Great. So many New Yorkers understand the distress and hardship that can be caused by construction work within their buildings, but folks often forget about the lead hazards that lurk under many layers of paint, which can be released by construction dust. Construction and renovations can be extremely stressful for tenants. I think anybody who has had work or large-scale work done in their buildings understands that, and it can also be very dangerous when it's not performed properly. Unfortunately, unscrupulous landlords are known to use construction as a means to make life difficult for tenants and to drive them out of their homes when they're rent regulated. This practice has come to be known as construction as harassment, and it's not to be tolerated. Fortunately, however, the law is on your side.
Ed, you're on mute.
Yeah, it looks like you're muted, Ed.
Okay. Under Local Law 1 of 2004, your landlord must follow these guidelines when performing work that disturbs lead-based paint in your home. They're supposed to hire firms certified by the US EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, when disturbing more than 100 square feet of lead paint, replacing windows, or fixing violations issued by the New York City Housing Preservation Department, or HPD. They need to use lead-safe work practices and train workers when fixing lead paint hazards and when doing general repair work that disturbs lead paint. They need to seal floors, doors, and other openings with plastic waterproof tape in the work area. They must clean the work area with wet mops and HEPA vacuums every day and after the work is done. They need to post warning signs around the work area, and they need to hire a professional to check dust levels after the cleanup. And it should be noted that these laws have, this law has not been adhered to very well, and it's seldom enforced. Hopefully that will change. Next.
So in New York City, when your landlord is planning to perform construction or renovations in your building, they're required to post work permits, a tenant protection plan, and a safe construction bill of rights before any work is performed. Here's an example of a standard work permit. You can check the permit for a description of work in order to ensure that your landlord has permission to perform the work that's being done. And if you notice work being performed outside of the scope provided on the permit or after the permit's expiration, you should certainly report that illegal work to 311. And here you can see the area where the expiration of the permit is noted, being pointed to by this red arrow. So it's required that your landlord post the tenant protection plan on the landing of every floor of your building while work is being performed. They also have the option to distribute TPPs to each tenant individually. The tenant protection plan, abbreviated as TPP, as I just did, will provide specific information about egress or emergency exits, fire safety, as well as requirements for the mitigation of health concerns such as dust, debris, pests, and any anticipated disruptions of essential services like water, gas, or electricity. Here's an example of a basic tenant protection plan. If you don't receive a tenant protection plan, if there's not one posted throughout your building, or if you don't receive one individually from a landlord or their agent and work is being performed, check the Department of Buildings website and call 311. Your landlord is also required to post what's known as a Safe Construction Bill of Rights, which provides more specific information on the work being done in the building, the amenities or essential services that might be interrupted or unavailable during work. And it also provides contact information for your landlord's designated employee who can help you in case of an emergency. Here's an example of a Safe Construction Bill of Rights. One or more of the 3 items highlighted here should be initialed by your landlord, and they should fill in a description of work and anticipated outages on the lines below. If you notice construction occurring in your building without a Safe Construction Bill of Rights posted, you should certainly call 311. And it's also important to ask for help and to document your situation. If you believe that works being performed in your building, disturbing lead-based paint, or without permits, without any of the notices that we mentioned earlier, you should certainly call 311, as well as taking time-stamped photos of any dubious work that you think is being performed. It's also great to keep a written record of harassment and to reach out to your neighbors and to ask them to do the same. It's really crucial that tenants in your building are united in monitoring construction when dangerous conditions are present, especially if you plan to try to hold your landlord accountable for forcing you to live through these unsafe or dangerous conditions. Essentially, document, document, document. These records are really a crucial weapon in the fight against constructionist harassment and lead exposure, especially if you feel it'll be necessary for a judge or a city agency to step in. The Google Suite is something I didn't mention earlier, but it's been a really great tool for tenant associations that we've worked with at Cooper Square in allowing people to kind of continually and collectively update shared documents in kind of a really up-to-the-minute way, and eventually hand them over to agencies or officials in power. So if your landlord's choking you with dust, get organized. If you haven't already, you should definitely talk to your neighbors and local community organizations about forming a tenants association. A vigilant and well-informed TA is really the best defense against lead exposure and constructionist harassment, and against tenant harassment, exploitation, and gentrification in all forms. It allows you and your neighbors to really begin kind of envisioning a future for your neighborhood that goes beyond the plans of landlords and developers. I think it's safe to say that tenants are often surprised by the power they're able to weld when they come together, even beyond their immediate buildings. It's important for your TA to know that you have rights and to ensure that they're respected. Local Law 1 of 2004 was passed with the explicit aim of ending childhood lead poisoning, and it was passed as a result of grassroots community action, as Brandon mentioned. It's evidence that building level organization can and will help affect change on every level, regardless of whether you're trying to get the attention of your landlord, a city agency, or policymakers. As outlined earlier, under this law, your landlord must follow very specific guidelines when performing work that disturbs lead-based paint. And now we move into our third quiz of the night. So what should you do if you expect that local law 1 isn't being followed? Call 311, look for a TPP, Safe Construction Bill of Rights and Permits, take photos, notify your neighbors, or all of the above. And it looks like Ted, Jill, and Kenny were right in the chat. The answer is 5, all of the above. It's really important to protect the health of children in the building if the landlord is ignoring local law 1 during renovations. And we'll now turn the presentation over to Sandy Meyer and Dr. Markowitz, who will discuss ways to protect your health if you're concerned about lead poisoning.
Thank you. So I'm Dr. Markowitz, and I've been taking care of lead-poisoned kids and pregnant women for about 45 years. I hope there isn't any difficulty in hearing me. Yeah. So you wouldn't be attending this meeting if you weren't concerned about your health, the health effects of lead, and how to try and mitigate the exposure. Somebody mentioned that we've known about the effects of lead for the last 100 years. It's true from lead paint, actually longer than 100 years now, almost 120 years. But we've known about lead as a poison, and it's a pure poison. There's not a single benefit from having lead in any person's body, any animal's body that's ever been described. So we've known about the effects of lead at least for 2,300 years, because the first medical description by a physician was about 300 BC, who described an occupationally exposed adult who was dying from it, and described a therapeutic intervention, which was get him away from the lead smoke that he was inhaling as he was melting rocks to extract the metals. So despite knowing about it for millennia, we've continued to use it because it's cheap and it makes many different compounds. And each of those compounds has different characteristics. And that makes it very useful for hundreds to maybe 1,000 products that are being used all over the world. So to get into the body, you have to do something. It's not enough to have it on the walls where the dust is there. And kids invariably get lead poisoned by eating something with lead. There are a couple exceptions. We have a teenager we're taking care of in clinic who was shot, and the lead bullet is contributing its lead to her lead poisoning. And it makes it tough to treat because there can be an enormous amount of lead in the remains of that bullet, and its location can be too hazardous to take out surgically. So you have to eat it. And why kids are a greater concern than adults? Well, I'm not sure that they really should be, because everyone can be poisoned at any age if you eat enough lead or get enough into your body. But kids proportionally will absorb a greater percent of what they eat, because the body can't differentiate between lead and calcium. And kids need the calcium. They're growing bones. They have to get filled with calcium. So they absorb more of the calcium that they eat, and lead can sneak in through the same doorway. And once it comes into the body, it goes into the blood, and the blood is the delivery vehicle. It'll deliver lead atoms to every cell in the body, not just the brain, which is what most people worry about for kids, everywhere. The reason we think about the brain is because the brain happens to be really sensitive. Next slide, please. So however you picked a product to put in your mouth, whether it's dust coming off your fingers or your toys that has lead in it, or a lead chip or chips day after day for chronic lead ingestion, or it's coming off your crib. That's an old crib and was painted with lead paint, and you're using your new teeth to chew it. Or the same thing, you're using those same teeth to hang from the windowsill. You'll get that lead into your mouth, you'll swallow it, you'll absorb a small percentage of it, but day after day it accumulates in your body because the blood is delivering that lead everywhere, and the place most of it ends up, if it's not excreted, is in your bones. And there it can stay for years, years to decades. So it's really important to try and prevent it from getting in. As more lead comes in and gets into all those tissues, it causes more damage, it accumulates, and organs become disrupted in their function. And most of the time, you don't know it. You don't have a symptom that's giving you a warning, like a headache, being dizzy, being tired, irritable. Well, not from the lead. You may have other reasons for all of those symptoms. Or having stomach aches and constipation, which is some of the earlier symptoms from it. All those things happen in kids, and you'll see in the next slide, for those of you that can see these slides, that it's true in adults as well. Next slide, please. So when you have symptoms, when you know something is wrong with you and you're going to go to a clinician to find out what's happening, we call that clinical lead poisoning. And before that, we call it subclinical. Things are happening, the organ's dysfunctional, but you don't know. And the brain is very much an organ that's working that way. The damage to the brain occurs with incredibly little lead in it. It's the most sensitive organ in the body to lead. So it takes the least amount of lead in order to have harm. So how do you know? You don't, but if you do formal testing of groups of kids, you can see that cognitive scores drop the more lead is in that group of kids. Their behavior worsens, their attention spans shorten. When we look at adults, we see the same things are happening. And because adults have a very long time horizon for exposure and getting lead into their bodies, they can also inhale lead, not just eat lead. and absorb it through their lungs if it's in fine enough form, tiny, tiny particles. They can accumulate lead in the kidneys and end up with end-stage renal disease. They'll have cardiovascular issues. All of these things can result in lethal outcomes. Brain effects, chronic kidney disease, cardiovascular crises. So we never wanted to get to a symptomatic point. We don't even want subclinical disease to be happening. So what do? Keep going on this slide. Tap again. And again. Thank you. So we have to have some way of figuring out how much lead might be in a person and whether that's going to relate to a toxic outcome. And we rely on the blood lead level, which has also been measured and mentioned several times previously. Why do we use a blood test when the lead is only transiently in the blood? It's on its way to somewhere else. It's the highway. You're going from one city to another city, and you're parking yourself in the other city. And the time that it stays in the city is much longer than it stays in the blood. And the answer is because we don't like to do serial biopsies of brain in kids or bone biopsies in kids or adults. It's not very convenient, and I don't think anybody would allow their kids to have it done. Blood, okay, you still have to poke a child with a needle, either in a finger or in a vein, preferably in the vein. But that's socially acceptable, and most parents will allow it. And so we can find lead in blood as an indicator not just of exposure, but a process of moving from exposure into the body and then potentially ending up in the organ causing harm. And we have relationships between the amount of lead that we can measure in the blood and potential harm outcomes. So our numbers have changed. If you can see this slide, you know that the cutoff, the alarm bells go off at a level of 60 back in the 1960s. And that number has gone all the way down to 5 micrograms per deciliter as of this millennium, actually only in the last 10 years. The 5 microgram per deciliter intervention level is not the same as the toxicologic threshold. Lead poisoning, lead bad effects might be happening as soon as you get above 0, but they're small. The more lead in your brain, the more brain toxicity is going to be there, and potentially the harder it is to reverse it. So 5 micrograms was picked by the CDC because it signified the kids with the most lead. When they surveyed a population of kids across the United States in 2010, the top 2.5% had a lead of 5 or more. It was a triage. They had to pick a number for intervention. When you put the money into public health efforts, into the primary care providers getting involved, and 5 was picked. But it's a moving target. The more we learn about lead, the lower that number should be. Sandy, you're on.
Well, we're going to also talk a little bit about testing your family and your home. So if you're concerned that anyone in your family has been exposed to lead, make sure you work with your healthcare provider, get a blood lead level test for yourself and your family. Make sure you test your children. Screen at ages 1 and 2, test annually to age 6, and you can also ask for developmental assessment tests. And then this is a bit of a review from everything that we've been saying previously, but work with your landlord when possible. They're not always cooperative, but report peeling, cracked, or loose paint in your apartment. Absolutely report shoddy work. Again, call 311, ask for a free inspection, and then ask for healthy homes. So I'm going to be continuing to talk about prevention and also nutrition. So again, some of this is a review, but to minimize lead, dust, and smoke in your home, do not renovate or remodel without a lead test. Don't touch anything. Do not sand, scrape, expose any exposed surfaces. Be careful even nailing in old plaster. You can have like microscopic bits of dust come from that. No street shoes in the home would also be required if you really want to keep a clean house. During renovation work, demand that your landlord follow safe work practices. We've said that again and again and again. That's so important. And interestingly enough, do not allow smoking in your home if possible, because secondhand smoke does have lead and it will impact your children. The next slide. So COVID-19 has increased our need for lead dust prevention. Why is that? Well, again, this is a repeat of what's been said, that approximately 80% of New York City's residential housing stock contains lead. Where have we been hanging out during COVID-19? We've been in our homes. So due to the pandemic, families and school children are all being perhaps exposed more than they would have. The good side is COVID-19 has also given us time to purge, to organize, and to clean. And then this is just one more thing just to keep in mind. The DOH Healthy Homes Division, there's a lead dust safety number. You might want to photograph that or write it down. It's 646-632-6023. You may need that number someday. Just onto the next slide. Okay, and again, prevention, cleanliness is a preventative against lead, keeping a clean house. So if you have a vacuum cleaner, check in to see if it has a HEPA filter. If it doesn't, you may want to splurge and get yourself a better vacuum cleaner. If you have one with the HEPA filter, don't forget to replace it at least once a year. That's something we need to do. Next, clean with a mop and soapy water after vacuuming. And don't forget to clean windowsills, play areas, areas of the floor under windows, babies' pacifiers and toys. Wash babies and toddlers' hands and feet frequently. Just check and see what they're up to. Wash your own hands before food preparation, and use contact paper on shelves that have chipping or peeling paint. We had this problem. It was impossible to clean this one shelf. It was way up high, and we looked at it. It absolutely needed the contact paper. It kind of solved that problem. So our building is from 1876, so we certainly have all these problems. Okay, I'm going to talk also a little bit about nutrition. Again, it dovetails with what Dr. Markowitz was talking about, where your body takes in lead instead of calcium. You need calcium. So if you look at the blue section on the left, calcium helps keep bones strong, keeps lead out. So make sure your family is eating dairy products like yogurt, cheese, and broccoli. Now, for this to be absorbed properly, you also need vitamin D. That will help the calcium be absorbed. Not that many foods have vitamin D, like fatty fish, salmon, sardines, and herring. That may be fine for an adult. A lot of children will not eat that. So make sure, most milk is fortified. That's usually okay, but check and see if your orange juice is too, because that's another way you can get vitamin D. Iron. Iron helps block lead from being absorbed in your body. I'm in the green section now. If you're not a vegetarian and you eat meat, your meat will, the iron in your meat will be readily absorbed in your body. If you're a vegetarian and you eat cereals, make sure they're iron fortified. You might want to consider eating peaches, apricots, dried fruits, beans, and lentils. But again, if you're a vegetarian, you want to unlock that iron and you want to help that iron get absorbed. You will need to eat vitamin C along with those foods like pineapples, oranges, and kale. That combination is key. And there are other foods you probably could Google, but this is at least something to get you started. So we're up to the quiz. How could COVID-19 affect lead exposure? The virus makes lead exposure worse. People moving out of New York City can disturb old paint. Social distancing causes greater lead absorption. Some masks may contain lead. People are exposed to lead dust in older homes. So I'll give you a chance to think about it or write in your thoughts on that. You can. So the answer, since families are spending more time at home, children are especially at risk of exposure to lead dust in older apartments. And if you haven't figured that out, Lead Dust Free NYC and Cooper Square Committee want to eradicate that. We want this to be a thing of the past. So now we're on to the next section, which is Jody Lydecker from Cooper Square Committee. I've really enjoyed working with Jody for the last 2 years. I feel like I've known her my whole life. Jody.
Thanks. Sorry, I had to unmute. So now we've given you a lot of information, and we want to tell you a little about efforts to combat lead and invite you to join us. Next slide, please. We formed a coalition of advocacy groups, and there is also a tenant-led organization, Lead Dust Free NYC, which is co-presenting this workshop, and you can see their logo on the upper right-hand corner of the screen. Next slide. So we're working hard to combat lead exposure. Last year, the New York City Council passed several significant pieces of legislation to help address this problem. Next slide. Here are some documented cases of lead exposure in the Lower East Side. Most of these happened during landlord renovations, and you can see some of them were extremely high levels of exposure, like 440 times the legal limit. And we think there are many more instances which have gone unreported. And this just says there's an average of 70 times the legal limit that we've found. Okay, next slide, please. So Lead Dust Free and Cooper Square and our other coalition partners, they've been working hard fighting lead dust exposure. And Lead Dust Free has been a really strong leading tenant group that's working to bring attention to the lead issues. And they've been supporting lots of tenant association actions and events, as well as other events to hold bad actors accountable and demand that work be done safely. You can see a list of some of the things they've done in the last couple of years. Next slide. So here are some pictures from some of the events. Yeah, that's me, just like a turkey.
You look great there.
Yeah, thanks. Sandy made that costume. Next slide, please. You can see the media really does help spread awareness. The tenants have done so much work and have really struggled to get their landlords to do safe work. So they bring attention through the media. And you can see working together is really powerful.
Actually, I'd like to mention that screenshot in the upper right there, the one that says lead poisoning, City Council passes slate of lead laws. That screenshot shows lead loopholes, which was a document speaking specifically about landlord abuses in the case of lead dust poisonings across New York City. And it was put together by Cooper Square, NMIC, the New York State League of Conservation Voters, I think New York Public Lawyers, I forget what LPI stands for. But,
New York Lawyers in Public Interest.
That's it, New York Lawyers for the Public Interest. It's a really great booklet. Cooper Square probably still has copies of it. It makes for riveting reading.
Yeah, we can share those. Okay, so next slide, please. So reach out to us if you have other questions or you want to be involved. If you live outside the Lower East Side, we can connect you with your local housing group. Just remember, lead poisoning is completely preventable. And with our combined efforts, we can stop this. So that's it. Let's go to the next slide. These are some references and resources. We'll put them in the chat, and we can take any questions you have now that didn't get answered. Thank you.
If you have questions, you can raise your hand or ask in the chat. It looks like we have our first question actually coming from Nikki. I think it's directed toward Morri, asking about which proteins are detrimentally affected by lead.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So lead binds to proteins that typically will bind calcium, of which we make a few hundred. And in fact, if you were to put any human-made protein in a test tube and add equal amounts of lead and calcium, the protein will preferentially bind the lead. in almost all cases. So not only does the body have difficulty in distinguishing between lead and calcium, right? Calcium it needs, lead it poison. It prefers the lead, right? So I guess it's the idea of the bad boy being attractive for some reason. Whatever it is, it's not good. And unfortunately, we don't have equal amounts of calcium and lead because we wouldn't survive that. There's overwhelmingly more calcium. So that's a saving aspect to it. When we move away from the calcium binding proteins, Nick, you asked about hemoglobin. So lead in red blood cells, when we measure it in blood, we're not measuring the lead that can float in the clear part of blood, the plasma, which is actually where the lead can leave the blood compartment and go into the cells from. 98% of the lead that we're measuring in the lab from that blood sample is attached to the red blood cell. And a lot of that is attached to hemoglobin. So hemoglobin has two parts to it. I don't want to go too many levels down, but one of them is heme and the other is globin, hemoglobin. So the lead mostly attaches to the globin molecule, but it has profound effects on the production of the heme part of it. There are 8 steps the body has to go through to produce its heme. And those steps are in almost every cell, not just the red cells. Hemoglobin is necessary for oxygen carrying, but heme is necessary for many other functions throughout the body. 3 of those 8 enzymes, 3 of those steps are poisoned by lead. And eventually you end up with not enough heme to combine with hemoglobin, and that's how you get anemic. One of the 2 ways you get anemic from more severe lead poisoning. Does that answer the question? Did that answer the question with too much information?
So I think our
I see Nikki has another question. Also really good. This is about really how is lead harming the brain? Well, why is the brain so sensitive? So one of the things that's extremely important in the brain is communications within the brain cells, the neurons, the glial cells, and communication between the nerve cells. And the way the cells communicate with each other is they mail a little package from one to the next. So you have to have somebody sending the mail. So that's a release mechanism for the message, and the message is called a neurotransmitter. And then you have to have a mailbox on the next cell, which is a receptor for that piece of mail, for that neurotransmitter. The way that the message gets out of the first brain cell is a calcium-dependent process, and lead can affect that process by binding to the protein that really needs calcium. And when lead is on those calcium proteins, it changes its shape and it doesn't work as well, or it works at the wrong times. So the neurotransmitter might not come out when it's supposed to, or it may not come out potentially at all. And if it does come out and it is carried across to the next cell, the basket to get that into position, to catch the mail, to catch that neurotransmitter, depends on the right amount of zinc. And that's another metal that interacts with lead in a detrimental way to people. So the communication between the cells can be affected from the first cell and the receiving cell. So you get garbled communication. The same thing is happening inside the cells, garbled communication. And when enough of those things are happening, your house falls down.
Great. And it looks like our next question comes from Hank Dombrowski, who called in and has his hand raised here. And then after that, I think we'll take Nina's question from the chat.
Yeah, but I'm on the phone, so I have to speak my question. I actually had 2 questions. And one, someone said that lead is transferred in secondhand smoke. Is that true?
Yeah, if the tobacco is grown, or there are, it's not pure tobacco that people smoke in a cigarette. It's tobacco with many other chemicals modifying its flavor and how fast it burns, and the paper, what's in the filter. So there are many components. So there are many chemicals that can be inhaled. And lead can be a contaminant. I don't think the tobacco industry intentionally uses lead, but it can be a contaminant of those chemicals or of the tobacco leaf if the plant has been grown in leaded soil, potentially. So for me, it's a speculation as to how the lead gets into the cigarette. But once it's there, you're going to inhale it, either as the primary user of the cigarette or through the secondhand smoke.
I see. And my other question was, I was actually told by a doctor that lead in the form of a bullet is not harmful because it's not in a dust form traveling in the air.
You definitely do not you don't have to have lead in a dust form to get lead poisoned. You can get lead poisoned by eating lead chips. You're not going to get much lead out of any individual chip, but with chronic eating of chips, you will get lead poison. So coming back to the bullet, even if you lick that bullet, you could potentially get a little bit of lead from it. But the reason it's a source of lead poisoning in the 16-year-old that I alluded to earlier is because when you have the bullet in your body, it depends a lot on where in your body it is as to whether the lead can come off the bullet, get into the blood, and then it's just as if you ate lead. It'll get carried everywhere in the body. So if it's in a muscle, let's say, then the body's going to build scar tissue around it eventually. And that walls it off from the rest of the body. So you might leach a little bit of lead in the beginning, but there'll be less and less coming off the bullet. But if that bullet is near a joint where there's fluid, or unfortunately in my patient, it's by the spinal cord, which is bathed in spinal fluid, that liquid continually bathing the piece of bullet that's in contact with it continually dissolves some of that lead. And that's how you get poisoned. So I would strongly disagree with the person who told you that you have to have lead dust in order to get lead poison. A bullet is bad.
Maybe the exact words were soluble lead, and a bullet's not soluble, is what he told me.
It is soluble. It's soluble. Anything is soluble that has lead, pretty much. Most lead compounds, if you have enough acid. I thought what he was talking about really is that if you're shooting a gun, you can also get lead poisoned from the bullet. Not because you shot yourself, but because when you shoot it, there is fumes that come off of it from the explosive part of it. And if you're in an indoor shooting range, right, you're practicing, or you're a cop, or you're an officer in the Army somewhere where you're practicing indoors, if the ventilation isn't as per specs by OSHA standards, then you'll have a lot of lead in the air in a very fine form, very tiny particles, which you'll inhale and that you can absorb. And of course, it can settle on surfaces. So if you're a hand-to-mouth, or if you bite your nails and you're in that shooting range all the time because you're the sergeant in charge, or you're supposedly cleaning it, you can get lead poisoned by eating it as well. But directly through inhalation is a problem. And in fact, just like secondhand smoke, it can happen from the gun range. There was an example of that out in California that I was involved in, where the shooting range indoors, poorly ventilated, but ventilated. The exhaust went right next door where there was a gym for little kids, for gymnastics.
Wow.
So yeah, they were preschoolers up through elementary school kids that were there every day.
God.
And the whole place was totally contaminated with lead. All the surfaces, some of the air. And a bunch of the kids who were spending a lot of time there had elevated lead. So they weren't shot, but it came from the bullets.
Wow. Well,
we had a
thank
case.
you.
Yeah,
Um,
we had a case with renovations that were happening in a Lower East Side building where the landlord had no idea how to handle the proper procedures and had his work crew set up a fan and pull the dusty air out of the building into a air shaft, which was shared by another on the ground floor, a daycare facility. So at the time, the council member's office had to go ahead after we found out this was happening and contact the daycare facility, and they had to share this information with all the parents. So yeah, it's there's all kinds of different ways when people aren't being careful that this can get everywhere in a scary way.
Yeah. So Nina, your question was, am I recommending even elderly people should take calcium supplements and also by implication zinc? So we all need specific nutrients on a regular basis. And among those nutrients are what we call the essential metals. Metals is another way of talking about most of the elements. If you remember from high school in the periodic table, right, we're over 100 identified elements, and plus the man-made elements, we're over 110. So most of the elements that we encounter can be considered metals or metal-like, called metalloids. Lead is a metal. It's a heavy metal. It's got a lot of protons in it and neutrons in its nucleus. And it's a competitor with metals that aren't necessarily heavy. Like calcium's not that heavy. It's kind of in between. So calcium your body absolutely needs. Even in old age, if you're not getting enough calcium, you're going to develop osteoporosis faster. And of course, in order to get the calcium to come into your body, as Sandy described earlier, you have to have the vitamin D preparing your intestine to open the doors for it to come in. And the same is going to be true for iron. The same is going to be true for zinc, probably copper. We focus the most, or I do in my talks, about calcium and iron because by far we have more data, research data, indicating the relationship between those metals and lead. But it seems to be true for the other essential metals as well. And I gave an example for the neurotransmitter, for the basket, the receptor, getting into position being a zinc-dependent process. For brain development, you need iron. And your brain, you don't want it to deteriorate, and you don't want to become anemic. So you need these essential elements throughout the lifespan.
I wish we'd brought more cheese and broccoli to the Zoom meeting.
Great sources of calcium, but neither one with D.
Okay, vitamin D fortified milk too.
So if anybody else who's calling in has questions, I just want to remind you that you can press *9 to raise your hand if you're calling in, and *6 to unmute yourself. We do have a few people on the phone here, and I want to make sure that their questions are heard too. However, if you do have more questions for the chat or that you'd like to ask, please feel free to raise your hand or ask away in the chat too.
Okay. I have a quick question about a piece of jewelry actually that I own with, I think it's made out of pewter. Pewter is part lead, isn't it?
Yes, historically it's one of the elements in pewter.
Yeah, you should not wear that, right?
I don't know about wearing it. I think it's you shouldn't mouth it.
Yeah, but a lot of people do that actually. They touch things, yeah.
They do. And in fact, one of the cases, more than one, of severe lead poisoning that I know about were little amulets, not pewter, but same concept of a metal alloy that had a lot of lead in it. And it was small enough, it was around the neck, it was a charm, right? So it's sort of a semi-religious purpose of having it. 1-year-old, and he would suck on it. And then one day it was only the string was left and the amulet was gone. And the parents could look around for it, but they didn't find it on the floor. He developed severe abdominal pain, and they brought him in and they did an x-ray of his belly, and they see this what looks like a little amulet on the x-ray, and they think, oh, it must be on the outside of his body. They didn't take it off his shirt. So they examined the kid, and it's not on his skin. He doesn't have any clothes on. They realize it's in his stomach. And because it was too big to get out of the stomach, it was bathed in acid. And I mentioned earlier that you really need the acid to dissolve the product that you ate. And so he became what we would call acute lead poisoning. He was poisoned in less than a week, in a few days, and his lead level reached 100 because the amulet was leaching the lead at a fast rate. If he'd gotten it out of his stomach, if it passed through and got into the small intestine, very little lead would have come out after that. So that was his terrible luck, and his parents totally unintentioned. You know, they're trying to do good for him, but it was harmful. And we see that not only with the charms, but also with imported medicines that are prescribed for various ailments from countries from all over the world, but especially from Central America, traditional medicines from Asia, South Asia, Ayurvedic medicines, Chinese traditional herbal medicines, that the practitioner, who often is the one who mixes it, their own pharmacist, thinks that lead is an essential part of their medicine, and they put it in there. And unfortunately, we in Western medicine have a very different perspective of what lead is doing, and it's not a benefit. So we end up with severely poisoned people that way, kids and adults. I have a pregnant woman on Long Island right now who was lead poisoned because in order to have a healthy pregnancy, before she got pregnant, she started using a medicine that was sent to her by relatives in South Asia, she and her husband. And she got pregnant, she continued to use it, her husband stopped, and she had a miscarriage. She waited a couple of months, was using the medicine again, and this time had an obstetrician who tested her for lead, and it came back in the 50s, and it was traced back to the Ayurvedic medicine that she was using to try and have a healthy baby. So I think she lost the first one from lead poisoning, and she's at high risk for losing the second.
So, Dr. Markowitz, in the chat, Nikki's recalling an event that you spoke at the Brooklyn Historical Society, where you mentioned that porphyrin was an indicator of future damage. Is this correct?
Thank you. First, thanks, Nikki, for coming to hear me twice. I'm really pleased that you could last through two of my talks. So the answer is we do measure something called protoporphyrin. Again, looking at a blood lead level gives us important information about exposure and lead having gotten from the source of exposure into the body. But the analogy I use is it's a snapshot. It's a one point in time. And not only is it one point in time, it's one tube of blood. It doesn't tell us how much is in the bone, how much is in the brain, or what effects have occurred in any individual. We know it's poisonous in relationship to blood lead levels when we look at groups of people. We get a picture, but it's a little bit of a fuzzy picture. And in individuals, it gets fuzzier and fuzzier. It's as if you're getting too close to the screen and you're trying to see individual pixels. It's pretty hard to do that. So you need to have repeated lead levels to give more information, or we can look at a biochemical, something the body makes that can be affected by lead. So I mentioned the heme pathway on its way to becoming part of hemoglobin or other molecules, and that there are 8 enzymes in the production of heme. The last step to make heme is the conversion of a molecule called protoporphyrin, sticking an iron atom in the middle of it, and now we call it heme. That enzyme that facilitates the conversion, the sticking of the iron atom into the protoporphyrin, is poisoned by lead. So it's like the sink is dripping, but the drain is getting plugged. So the water starts to rise. And that water in your sink going up and up is the protoporphyrin level, because the drain is getting stuffed because the lead is poisoning the drain. So we can follow protoporphyrin levels in kids who have, or adults, who have blood lead levels of 20 or more. It's a useful biochemical test that measures toxicity and not indirectly gives us a hint of the potential for toxicity. But under 20, it doesn't differentiate. Did that help, Nikki? Good.
So it looks like Jody had a question in the chat also. She was wondering if there's any way to tell if you were exposed to lead as a kid, even as an adult, to kind of.
Yeah, so I guess that's for me too. So theoretically, the answer is yes. So lead is really mostly in our bones. For everybody on this conference line, I'm assuming everyone is an adult. 95% of the lead in our bodies, and everyone here has lead, is in our bones. In a kid, it's not so much. There's about 30% in the soft tissues, right? So you can have more harm happening in the soft tissues. In the bone, it's in the crystalline part of it, the hard part, mostly, which is where the calcium is. And the lead there only comes out as little tiny bits of lead, of bone, are being dissolved, which is happening all the time in our bodies. Microscopic amounts of bone are being broken down and new bone is being formed. When that's in balance, you're in good shape. When the bone breakdown is happening more than the bone formation, you end up with weaker bones, less bone, and that's what we call this osteoporosis. So if the lead accumulated in a kid, let's say up to age 5, I'm just throwing out a number, but it really could be any number, and there's a lot of lead in the bone, that bone is going to stay there, even some of it, to age 20. And it might be detectable by a technique called XRF, X-ray fluorescence, which is the same concept, the same kind of equipment that's used by the sanitarians when they go into a building and test the walls with their machine. It's like a ray gun. X-rays come out, and if there's lead in the paint on the wall, they get excited and they put out photons. It comes back into the machine, and the machine records it and counts it. And you can get an estimate of how much lead is in that wall at that spot. So that XRF technique can be used with a direct measurement of lead in a spot on a bone, typically in the tibia, the bone between your knee and your ankle. But it's a research tool, and it's been around for decades, but it really never made it out into the clinical world. No commercial company has made it. Maybe because it takes time. It takes 15 to 20 minutes to get a reading on the tibial lead content. So that would be a way. So if you were exposed up to, let's say, again, age 5, but now you're 35 years old, you probably won't have detectable lead from that early exposure. You certainly could have had many opportunities throughout your childhood and early adulthood for having new sources of exposure, new ingestions, new inhalations that would have contributed to your bone lead at that time. You'd have to beg a researcher in order to get a bone lead done. No, you would not be able to get HPD to scan you. It's not an approved instrument for people or animals.
I know. Thank you for writing the record there, Dr. Markowitz. That was a bad joke, but yes.
No, it's a good
they
joke.
do use, it is, as you said, the same technology HPD would use to come out and do a test in a unit if you had, chipped and peeling paint, or if you could get the city out to do some of the testing they do, they use that same technology. So, but that's good to know. That's good to know that there is same way to use it in other ways. Fascinating.
There is a potential way. Ted asked about what prompted the obstetrician to measure the lead level in the pregnant woman. A really good question. So the state Department of Health decades ago declared that all primary care providers for pregnant women have to assess for the risk of lead. And they could do it by asking questions, a questionnaire, or they can do it by doing a blood test. So that was the original thought. With with investigations done by the New York City DOH in particular, they found that a characteristic that made you more likely to have lead during your pregnancy was having been born in a foreign country, especially a third world country. And the consequence of that was that obstetricians in the New York City region and in other hospitals throughout New York State and other states, instead of going to the questionnaire, go directly to the blood test at the first visit to see if there's any lead. And it's a screening. So just like testing kids at age 1 and 2 is mandatory, although in kids it's mandatory with a blood test, in the pregnant woman, it's mandatory to screen, and the blood test is the most really direct way and much more definitive than using a questionnaire. And that's how she got found.
Thank you. Thanks. That's interesting.
Yeah.
And maybe we have time for 2 more questions. It looks like Hank has his hand raised, but about 10 minutes ago in the chat, Ellen asked about like going back to the 1960s when lead poisoning was first in the news. There's a lot of talk about pica and kids eating paint chips as kind of the method by which kids were most frequently exposed to lead. She's wondering if this was a real issue or just a way of blaming the victim. Others can answer, but I believe that hand-to-mouth activities like that are one of the main ways that young children are exposed to lead.
I'm happy to answer. Yeah, so I think
Sure.
You're right. I would completely agree with that. It's that hand-to-mouth activity. We do have kids that are willing to use their tongues directly on a surface. You know, they'll lick that windowsill from one end to the other, or if they're on the floor, they're willing to taste the floor. They're willing to use their mouths on anything, typically until around age 2 or so. And by age 3, half the kids are finished. But again, I want to stress this because it's not in the news, and it's sort of hidden by the fact that we're automatically testing at age 1 and 2, but then suggesting evaluate up to age 6. Hand-to-mouth activity doesn't go to 0. It goes from near 100% at around age 1 to maybe 20%, 25% in first graders, 10th graders, 25-year-old medical students, as has been studied. So as long as you have the behavior that brings stuff into your mouth that's not food, you're at risk for ingesting all sorts of things. Parasites, infectious agents, COVID right now. Should be a real lesson not to put anything in your mouth and to break your nail biting habit. But yeah, it's that hand-to-mouth activity that does it. Going back to the item in the 1960s, there were news items in the 1930s, the 1920s. And one of the reasons that it was stopped in Europe because there was press on it back at the turn of the 20th century, that limited the amount of lead that was allowed in paint. Although I don't know that it was always enforced. Because even in France, where there were some rules, there is a lot of lead paint still there. And other interesting sources like the lead top of Notre Dame. I don't know if you saw the New York Times story a couple of years ago. The big fire in Notre Dame in Paris resulted in not just damage, but in smoke pouring off the dome. And that smoke was lead smoke. And it contaminated for a plume for a few miles away from the from Notre Dame, from the cathedral. It wasn't lead paint. It was lead for the roof. So yeah, the 1960s news that pushed things along, but the lethality of lead in the United States for kids peaked probably in the 1930s and 40s. And not because lead disappeared, but because chelation came around. We had a drug. Our first drug was in the late 1940s that caused lead death. Lead caused death to plummet. If you got to the hospital, even if you were seizing and you got this drug called BAL, British anti-Lewisite, it could be a lifesaver. It didn't mean that you woke up and you were a normal kid again, but you were an alive kid. That's what changed. And in the 60s, we had another drug that we're using as well. And then in the late 70s, early 80s, our most recent drug, our gold standard drug, became available. That changed the face of lead poisoning also.
I think it's great that we started part of the presentation with some commentary on the young lords and other community activism to raise awareness about this, because, yeah, it takes the science to understand what's going on, but then because this is all embedded in a political economy, really, you know, without people making some noise and saying, I'm not going to stand for this, you know, we need to have stronger protections and stand up for ourselves. There's just, it's a long slog. And it's amazing that being a community-based organization working in the Lower East Side, we've seen, you know, in this corner of New York City, what we can do. And, you know, the council members and many others have started paying attention to this issue in a way it's quite unique. And even DOH at one point told us, oh yeah, you know, we get, you know, the vast majority of our complaints from Lower Manhattan at this point for construction issues that result in dust, because people have become more educated about it because of the work that LDF NYC has been doing and Cooper working with them. So yeah, it's pretty wild when you study the science of this and how long it's been around, but I think it's even more of a call to arms to say, like, let's keep working on the good work we do, all of us together, because I think it can be a really a potent combination of things, mixing, you know, the science and the awareness with public health and organizing. So looks like Jim has queued up one of our videos. I don't know if you want to play one of those.
Before we
sorry,
go
Liam,
into that,
go ahead.
I think Hank had his hand up for another question. That might be our last question of the evening. I think you're unmuted, Hank, so go ahead.
Yeah, are there ways to cleanse our bodies from lead if we've been exposed to lead?
An interesting question, because a question that just popped up in the chat was about chelation therapy. Is that, Morri, would you say that's still the kind of the primary method, or why aren't people getting chelation therapy at the same rates today, maybe?
Well, I think the reason for that is the limitations of our drugs. So our chelators, a chelator is just a molecule that'll grab a metal with at least two arms. You know, that's the chemical definition. Heme is a chelator, or the protoporphyrin is the chelator because it bound an iron atom, and combined it can bind a zinc atom. So the drugs that we developed for lead are not effective at getting the lead out of a person unless the blood lead is 45 or more. That's where the 45 standard comes from, at least in my opinion. And it's based on studies showing that if you give a drug to somebody who's got a different lead level, various lead levels, give it to different people, and you collect urine to see, well, what happened to the amount of lead that's being peed out, you'll see that there's a dramatic increase in the excretion of the lead through the kidney when the blood lead is 45 or more, and that level falls pretty rapidly if the blood lead level is lower than 45. So could we still manipulate the blood lead level by giving a chelator like Succimer or calcium EDTA to kids or adults who have a lead of 30? The answer would be yes, we could. But that doesn't mean that you're removing lead from the body at an accelerated rate. You're playing with your symbol of lead. It's coming back to, what is a blood lead level telling us? It's a symbol of exposure and absorption. It's not a direct measure of toxicity. It's not a direct measure of how much is in the brain or in the bone, or for how long it's been there. It's a hint to those things.
Right.
Right. So the drug, we want the drug to remove lead or to bind it in a way that it can't cause harm. So if you give these drugs, these chelators, to people with leads under 45, and it's really best studied in kids to get to that 45 number. If you give it to those kids, they won't take a lot of lead out, but the drug is hungry for a metal. It'll bind another metal. So if you don't have another heavy metal that it can attach to, like mercury, maybe uranium, maybe arsenic. But you really just have the lead. You're lucky, only lead. And you don't have enough lead to bind to the chelator, you'll end up losing your zinc, your iron. You're going to pee out your essential metals instead. And then you'll have deficiencies in those metals that you need. So that's why we don't treat under 45. I wish we had drugs that were specific for lead, just for lead as a heavy metal, or for the other poisonous heavy metals. And we don't.
Great. Thank you. Thanks. Interesting.
Yeah, thanks everybody for your great questions, and thank you, Dr. Markowitz, for your wonderful answers. I think we're all kind of coming away from this with a lot more knowledge than we are, a much deeper knowledge, I would say, than we had previously. And with that, should we move into these last couple of clips of the presentation, kind of highlighting the great work that Lead Dust Free NYC members have done, and some of the actions they've gotten into in the streets?
Yes, they're entertaining. Stick around.
And they're not long. There are 3 of them. The first one is 2 minutes long, the second one's 2 minutes long, and the third one is 1 minute long. So this first one is from a protest that was held in 2019 outside of an Evan Bell building on East 4th Street.
What do we do when our homes are under attack?
Stand up, fight back.
What do we do when our homes are under attack?
Stand up, fight back.
The results were horrifying. Just about a half day into demolition, wipe tests found lead dust on almost every floor and every surface.
There's a lot of diseases that affect people, like asthma, that we don't know what causes, all the factors that cause asthma. We know what causes lead poisoning. It's lead. It's not very complicated, okay?
We know in 2019 there is no reason tenants and children should be exposed to lead.
And I want you to know that I'll be standing here with you to hold these landlords accountable, because Evan Bell of Bell and Company, shame on you. Shame on you.
Shame on you. Shame on you.
Shame on you.
Lead Dust Free demands that you, Evan Bell, obey the law or provide a safe alternative dwelling for these families until construction is completed. Get the lead out. We will be watching you.
I think Evan Bell should be facing steep fines and penalties for what he's done here. I think the other landlords who've done it should as well.
Yeah.
There's no reason why they shouldn't be facing serious steep fines and penalties, or even jail time in repeat instances.
Yes.
There's no reason at this point.
Fight, fight, fight. Housing is a human right. Fight, fight, fight. Housing is a human right. Fight, fight, fight. Housing is a human right.
We can send out clips to or a link to the YouTube channel for LDF NYC, which has all the videos of all the actions that have occurred around the city, both down at City Hall and throughout the neighborhood. So you all can see more of what's going on that front end. We really do need more people to get involved. So if you're here tonight and you're persuaded and you're just learning about this campaign, please check in with Liam, Jody, myself, and we can get you linked up to some of the meetings and get you involved. But yeah, Liam, do you have any closing thoughts, any closing remarks that you want to make?
I'm not sure I do. There's a link to the YouTube channel in the chat, and it's been a great workshop. Thank you, everyone who presented and everybody who's been able to attend tonight. I think this is kind of yet another kind of notch in our belt, I guess, as a coalition in our base building and in our fight against lead poisoning. So, yeah, big thank you to everybody, and be well. Have a great night.